Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Optimizing Mother podcast. I'm really excited to be here today with Mrs. Nechoma Itkin. After getting to know so many of her daughters, it's exciting to finally see and talk to her. Welcome, Mrs. Itkin. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Mrs. Itkin is a shluch in Pittsburgh for over 40 years, and she's an educator. She taught in the high school level, preschool level, and is currently teaching third grade elementary girls. She strives to continuously grow in chinuch, and every day of teaching is a joy. And that's what we're doing here today. We're discussing chinuch on a specific level with our own families and a broader level, from the education system, but we're all educators, even if that's not our official title. We're mothers, we're educators, etc. And so many of us want to be a little bit more intentional with our chinuch, and that's why we have these conversations. So I'm grateful to you, Mrs. Itkin, for making the time for us today. And we're also a little related, so
yes. Get to know you as my kids get to know you.
Right, exactly. So I want to just dive right in with like an open mind, like an open question. When we talk about chinuch, we're obviously talking about a specific chinuch, a value-based chinuch, a Hasidic chinuch. That's why, we're sending our children to a Hasidic school. How do we, at home, how do we raise our children intentionally? I guess that's the question, intentionally parenting, with intentional Hasidic chinuch.
Well, let me start with some of my background. I was actually privileged when I was newly married to go and have with college classes. And she said something so interesting about marriage. She said, this is Rebbetzin Steingarten, those of my age who remember her. And she said, someone has a building plan, they build a building, and they don't just open up the building in the store and then they open up and said open for business. They have a business plan. The same way, too, you have to have a plan in marriage. And then as I started having children, I realized I also have to have an overall vision and an overall plan of what I want my home to look like overall, and then each child specific to their own needs. So, of course, the number one thing is everything is up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You have to daven to Hashem. And I think it's very important, which I'll touch several times during my talk, that hopefully the spouses, the husband and the wife, should be on the same page of what kind of outcome you want in chinuch. Whatever works for your family, but if there's a unity, that's already a very good message of chinuch. Sometimes you hear vertlach here and there, and I heard a word a while ago, many years ago, of a president who had on his table a plaque that said the buck stops here. And that, I was newly married, and that really, really spoke to me. I realized I'm the Akeres Habayis. I'm the one who's setting the tone. I have to have a plan. I have to think about it, and I have to implement it. So I'll just give you one example that was very much, very, very strong in my house. You can ask any of my kids that politics should not come into my home. I just did not like any politics. We're talking about family politics, community politics, school politics. Politics was never discussed in our home ever.
American politics or just
American politics, any politics. Politics never came into our home, any topic about politics, and specifically at the Shabbos table. The Shabbos table is all about Divrei Torah and Shabbos. So we never, and even if a guest would bring up politics, would listen for a quick minute and somehow nicely change the topic. So politics was something that, and I realized as time went on that there's a front door. Everybody has a front door to their house, and the front door is to open the door and welcome all the guests you come in. And years later, I realized 1 minute that door serves a dual purpose. It also leaves everything out that you don't want coming into your house. So that was sort of my chinuch, thinking of what I wanted and trying to implement it, but implement things in a very subtle way. Not this is our policy, this is our this. When I say things now, my girls look back and they say, "Ma, we thought you just did it. We didn't realize you actually gave thought to what you were doing." So it really has to be intentional. And I also, one of the main things is I also look to people who I respected very, very much, and how did they raise their children and what did they do to raise their children? And I would speak to them and try to get all kinds of good tips from them too. So it has to be intentional chinuch, and it has to be done in the inoculation of chinuch. I think is very slow. It's slow, layers upon layers, years upon years. And at the overall bottom line, as both my husband and I felt, we were so lucky to be Chabad Hasidim, that we are privileged, we are chosen. We felt we were lucky. Ashreinu Matay Flakenu, the kids heard about it all the time, how lucky we are to be Yidden, how lucky we are to be from Yidden. The Torah is so smart. The Torah really understands the human being. And this joy, this underneath overriding joy of gratitude of how privileged we were, hopefully we hope gave over to our children too.
So I hear what you're saying about having this vision, and today people are into vision boards and imagine and what type of children and what type of chinuch. And the question is like, how do you implement it? Let's say you have a vision that you want this home with Hasidisha pride or Hasidisha values. How do you take it from vision to actual implementation?
So let me just tell you what over the years I figured out. It took me a while to figure out, but I realized I have a certain derech that just works with my personality. And I would say it was sur meira v'asei tov. And so I thought about how should I do the sur meira and how should I do this asei tov, and all of it has to be done in a way that kids don't even realize that you're doing the sur meira and that you're doing the asei tov. So I'll give you a few sur meira examples. I was a kid who loved to read. I read 2 books a day every day of my life till I got married and had several kids. I went to the library. I read everything under the sun. When it came to my children, time for them to be at that stage in life, I didn't want them to do what I did and be exposed to what I was exposed to. So I had a library card, but I went with them to the library to take out a book of whatever book they needed. We tried to buy a lot of Jewish books, and nowadays is way more available than it was in my time. And also, I spoke to teachers many times. If it was a certain, even a fiction, a teacher would be glad to have a Jewish fiction book if it's well written. A lot of teachers were very flexible to use a Jewish book. So that was something the kids, it was never made a fuss over. I had the library card you needed. We went together, but it wasn't a thing. We borrowed books from other people rather. That's one thing. I grew up, a lot of people, we all played classical music. It was very, very beautiful. And classical music is soothing and relaxing. And it's like, and then when I finally learned that classical music connects you to the shirish of the composer, and like, oh, I realized 1 minute, we don't want to be connected to those shirashim. That's not who we're looking for subtly in our lives. So I made a very specific thing to have only nigunim playing in my house. My kids remember there was a time I couldn't wake them up in the morning, and I was trying this and this and this and this. So I finally went to the hallway. We had tape recorders in those days, and I played the nigunim in the morning in the hallway to wake everybody up. We drove a lot. We lived in Pittsburgh. So one of our things was to go to the Rebbe. We went very, very often. That's an understatement, to go see the Rebbe. And on the way, we played nigunim, we played Jewish music. So we sang nigunim as a family. So there was this concept of nigunim being always played in their background. So even if my kids go somewhere, they're exposed to non-Jewish music. They heard so much Jewish music that it becomes the more likable, acceptable thing that they liked. So the Sur Meira is very much, it's not done like, oh, we don't do this in our house. It's not our family midah. Sometimes you could say that, but it's really done in a very, very subtle way. I live out of town, and this is actually what my kids reminded me. I live out of town, and you go to the malls, which is a big thing, mall shopping on Sunday is very common out here. And this time of the year, every single solitary store plays holiday music. And I used to come to such a point of being eclectic. And then, the more you take a kid to mall shopping, the more they hear it, the more they sing along without thinking about it. So my kids said, oh, we remember, Ma, you stopped taking us mall shopping during these holiday seasons. So A, you shouldn't see the displays, and B, you shouldn't hear the music. So it means sometimes I'd have to go to the store, pick up a coat, bring it back. If it didn't fit, I'd make that extra trip to go back. But at least my kids should not be exposed in a subtle way to negative things.
So that's Sur Meira.
That was a lot of the Sur Meira. The Asei Tov, and that was very cute because Asei Tov, it took many years. It's not halacha what I'm saying now. It's just, Baruch Hashem, I'm blessed with a lot of daughters, and this I realized is going to be the reality of my daughter's life. So one of the things I wanted very much that my children should have is to get up in the morning and to say brachas. So I instituted, before you go to school, you say brachas, and you also say Shema, V'haya, and Vayomer. because I realized years later that when you're a busy mother and you're hectic and there's so much is going on in your life, and if you have something going on, a challenge in your life, you don't have time to pick up a sitter and daven. It's very beautiful. You'd love to in theory, but it just doesn't happen. So I at least wanted my kids to have this thing that you will go through life, you'll say brachas, and you'll say the Shema. So that will be like the minimum that a person's going to do in their life. And one of the things I also in the morning, go get a sitter. It's like you have to run around getting siddurim, and it's so difficult. So I blew up a brachas chart. Now they sell them. In those days they didn't. I blew up a very large brachas chart, and I had it hanging in my house. And so it was very convenient. They came down, they washed negavasser, and it was very convenient. Another thing I wanted to say, something I actually learned from my father, was the concept of netilas yadayim. My father.
You want to tell us who your father is in case people don't know your maiden name?
My father is a eunuch, and he was someone who was mishamash b'kaidish from the Rebbe, and he was a man who didn't talk much. He was a very quiet man, and we all learned from his actions, because actions spoke very, very loud. And this is just something from the home. Two things he did every day. If I was up when he was up, because he would get up very early to go to shul, I remember always he opened up his little wallet and he'd ask me, do you have tzedakah for the day? Before I went to school, that was it. But the thing that really impressed me, made a big impression on me, was the concept of netilas yadayim. My father, under the directions of the Rebbe, he taught how to cut diamonds. So he used till 8:00, and then he would come back to Crown Heights. And during the winter months, he would teach shechita class, something which the Rebbe told him to do. So he came home very late. He'd leave at 7 in. He'd come home 10:30 at night, very, very tired. But my father never went to sleep without walking around and checking to see if every single child has netilas yadayim by their bed. And if they didn't have netilas yadayim, he would quietly go and bring netilas yadayim by the bed. So the next day, the kid would have netilas yadayim by their bed. And he did this every single day. And he would never say the next day, oh, you forgot netilas yadayim. Oh, remember tomorrow, remember tonight. It was done quietly year after year after year. So I decided that I'm going to try and emulate my father, because there's always the same kids who netilas yadayim, you tell them, yeah. And of course, they don't get to it. And these are the kids who just, executive functioning is not their strongest point. So they don't get to it. And I said, okay, I'm going to try to copy what my father did. I'm going to go around, and I'm exhausted and I'm tired, but I'm going to bring netilas yadayim. So I started doing that. But I really had to work on myself on two things. One is not to have resentment, like, oh, I'm exhausted. It's 11:30, 12, and it's Shabbos tomorrow, and I have to go and give netilas yadayim to this one and that one. We have different floors you have to go to. I said, if I'm doing it, I have to do it without resentment, and also never telling the child the next day, oh, I bought your negavasser because you forgot. Never associating it with the negative. So this is what I chose to do, what my kids chose to do with their children. So I hope something passes along with all of that. Another thing is the Shabbos table was very strong in our family. It was actually a vision of mine, very, very strong. Baruch Hashem, my husband knew how to lead a Shabbos table. But even so, we live in such lucky times that there's so much available. So, my husband always tell a story of the Rebbeim, a story of tzaddikim, and every child would walk around and repeat the Divrei Torah. And it came to such a thing that all our guests, and we had a very open home, Baruch Hashem, but all our guests know that if you come into the Itkin house, prepare a short Dvar Torah. The Itkin's going to ask you for Dvar Torah. So the whole table was just about Shabbos and the Ruchnius and the atmosphere, that it was a holy atmosphere. You walked away a little bit more elevated, because that was the purpose of Shabbos. I want to add one more interesting thing I realized yesterday. I, Baruch Hashem, am blessed, as I said, with many, many daughters. And I realized if I have many daughters, I should celebrate. The Eibishter gave me a special gift, which they are an incredible gift, including my sons. But what we started doing in later years, and it's really one of my fondest memories, is that every Yontiv is Rosh Chodesh. Women's Yontiv is Rosh Chodesh. So 2 kids at a time would take that Rosh Chodesh. They'd make a very fancy, interesting supper. They would do a whole theme. They would do a game. It became a whole planning session. So it was like, 2 weeks of planning for Rosh Chodesh. And I remember the creative stuff the kids did. We all looked forward to it, and we celebrated our unique Yom Tif. And that was something that was very, I think, a beautiful memory in most of our minds was of our Rosh Chodesh.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love the Rosh Chodesh idea. I mean, so far I only have boys, but I don't know, Rosh Chodesh. Yeah, it's so nice. I want to just highlight something. You said something so beautiful about you didn't tell your kid, oh, I brought you nagelwasser, because you didn't. You kind of just brought it for them. I wonder if you could expound a little bit on this idea. You also said the word subtle, subtle chinuch, not making a big deal out of things. Explain how you could impart something without making such a big deal out of it.
Well, really, it's self work. It's self working on yourself. I've learned not to make a big deal. I mean, I have friends who have memories of my family and my children, because Baruch Hashem, I have children who are leaders, and they remember that. I know not everybody is this way, but sometimes my kids would be openly chutzpahdik to me, which is not that uncommon. And, and they would do certain things. And I tried so hard not to react, because the reaction is what they want. So I also was very, very careful to try to, my house was very lively, but I really made achlata not to scream and not to yell, not to raise my children through screaming and yelling. And so you walked into the house and you heard the screaming and the yelling, but it wasn't necessarily because of me. And many times, the kids would argue and fight and come, oh, who's right? This one's right, that one's right. This. And as I taught over the years, and as I became older, I realized that one of the greatest gifts you can give to a child or any children is conflict resolution. So as I got older and as I became a teacher, I realized there's always two sides of every story. And parents tend to hear their child with only one half of a story. And of course, we're biased to our children. So because I was in a position where I many times heard two sides of the story, I became very careful not to mix in so much. My kids who had fights, my kids who had problems with school. The older I got, the less I interfered with what was going on between the kids and their friends, and less that I was going on between the kids and their teachers. I would say, you speak to the teacher, you speak to the principal, to teach the children how to resolve the conflict. You have to make a decision. Which conflict is it worth getting involved in? And also, I have an interesting system till today. It's my own internal system, but I rate everything in my life. I always rate whatever issue it is, makes no difference what it is, on a scale of 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is this issue? Is it a 4? Is it a 9? That will decide how I'm going to get involved, that kind of thing. Then you will find the child who cannot advocate for themselves, which we all have. We have children who are very out there, and we have children, every type of child who's not there. So the child who cannot advocate for themselves, it's actually very important to be there for that child. They should feel that you hear them, even if you don't necessarily agree or disagree with them. And if you have a child, I look to my children, were they followers or were they leaders? A child who's a leader will get into conflicts very often because they want to control and take over the class, or take over the group, or take over the home. And they will always have conflict, but with maturity and time, that conflict, they learn. They learn what yes and what no. A child who is not strong and is a follower by nature, those children, you really do have to be more careful with them and advocate for them with the teacher. You have to give that child words, what to say to a friend, words, what to express to a teacher. And those are the children you have to be extra careful with, I think, in chinuch, because if you're a follower, those are the children. I was very, very careful who their friends were, because they will follow their friends. They will follow wherever they were led. They will follow whatever situation they're being exposed to, not because this, but because it's all the other follower. So in those kinds of instances, you do have to be way more careful. You have to look at your children, try to recognize who they are, and be a little bit more careful. Everybody needs a little bit different kind of chinuch. It's not across the board kind of thing.
Can you give more examples of that? Of everyone needs a little bit of a different type of chinuch or some type of, yeah.
Well, as a third grade teacher, I want to tell you some things that really changed the way I thought many years ago. There was a young lady in my class, and she raised her hand in the middle of class, and she said, Sara Itkin, so-and-so is bothering me. I am the class clown, and she wants me still to be the class clown and make fun, and I decided I don't want to be the class clown anymore. Now, that is not something you heard years ago in the third grade. So I spoke to the mother. I was like, wow, I was so impressed. She's told me that my child started going to therapy, and the therapist started pointing out, well, this is a kid, you have to realize, this was very interesting, because this is a kid who through preschool had issues, and they would speak to the parents, and parents said, no, it's the friends' issues, the friends' issue. By the time they hit third grade, the behavior finally showed itself at home. It took that long for the behavior to come at home, and the mother said, oh, it's not the friends. So she took her into therapy. I didn't know all this till after this child raised her hand. And what the therapist did was, explain to the child what your behavior are and why are people reacting to you a certain way. And it also gave her tools to how to use it and to express it. And through times, we are the older generation, and it's so interesting. I expressed what I'm going to express to somebody, and she said she did the same thing to her children. That once I expressed like an apology to my older half of my children, saying that they didn't get the help they needed that was available when the younger half was around, because it wasn't developed. All these therapies and all these interventions and all these processing, none of that was developed yet. And every child, most children, let me put that, most children will eventually get to where they need to get to. But the earlier the intervention, the easier it is their school career. They don't struggle so much. They catch up faster. Their self-esteem is better. And one of the things I learned the hard way was also that you do have to do intervention earlier, because when they're in second, third, and fourth grade, you still have a say. Once a child is sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, and you finally see, oh, there's an issue, and maybe you should get some intervention, whatever the intervention is, at that point, the children have too much pride and they don't want to go. So I'm even learning now as a third grade teacher, encouraging parents, there's many different kinds of things. Take care of things right now, and it will help your child much more in the future of their school career, which you have to try to make as good as possible for them.
I want to go back to something you were saying before about how things could have been maybe loud or noisy at home, but you didn't make a big deal out of it. I'm wondering if you're open to sharing, like how did you stay calm? What were some tools that you did to stay calm?
Actually, it's first of all, a couple of tools. One is I heard a friend say, or maybe in a speech I heard someone say, that instead of taking the child who's misbehaving and locking the child in the room, putting the child in the room, let's not use locking, putting the child in the room, put yourself in the room. So if it came that I got very upset with a child, I would put myself into the room and close the door. And my kids never liked it because they wanted whatever conflict to be resolved. And they were knocking on the door and screaming, but I stayed in that room till I calmed down, because there has to be a calming thing. Now it also depends. My kids remember now that they're older, they finally like sort of understand me. But I used to come home with my children at 4:00 after teaching. So I came home, pregnant, I had boarders, I had supper I had to serve. I was wiped out when I walked in at 4:00 together with the kids. And my kids all remember the first thing mommy did, she lay down on the couch and she took her nap. And after that nap, I got up and Baruch Hashem was able to be okay. But that was one of the things that now they finally understand why I did that. But that was one of the things that I had to do for myself, and that's what I ended up doing. You have to, and it's also I went to parenting classes a lot. In our community, there was different years, different times. You go to a parenting class, you take one of these chinuch books, you read them together as a group. Nobody had to prepare. We just, organic. And I love those classes, because for 2 weeks after you go to a class, it sort of buckles you down for 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, you're a little bit of calmer mother. And it's really a conscious effort. I mean, when I have kids yelling and screaming at me, and, I remember coming home. I mean, this daughter apologized now. I came home with a newborn baby, and the child was going through a very difficult teen years. And she came in, I was sat down in the bed from the hospital, and this child just was ranting and raving what I was doing wrong, and I didn't do this, and I wasn't there. So my husband finally took this child out of the room. Now, and this child remembers it very clearly. Years later, she apologized to me. But I remember, like, buckle, because when there's anger, a child is coming at you in anger. Anger is not a resolution. You just have to listen, and you have to be quiet, and you have to accept. And I always, even when a child tells me something and a teacher tells me something about my children, I learn to listen. I may not agree with what the adult is telling me about my child, but I know that within there's a kernel of truth. There's something there that I have to change my parenting style. I'll give you another example. One of my children did something very, very, that to me was like, I have a very high threshold. It broke the threshold. And I actually just a couple of years ago, I asked that child, do you remember that incident? Because I remember till today that incident. It was like, it crossed every line of everything that I treasured as far as a home and chinuch and being a mensch and everything like that. And I made a very, 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 very big deal about it. And it was such a big deal that child remembers till today, because that was the threshold that I want you to remember, that is never acceptable. That will never be okay. Whatever it is, that will never be okay. So you have to, each situation, but you have to really, it's a matter of working on yourself. Another thing that is a visualization that someone told us many years ago for Mashiach, you want Mashiach to come, pretend your principal or someone chashuv is sitting on your couch. And how would you act? Oh, hello, Kinderlach, so sweet. How are you? It's so nice. Suddenly the tone from yelling, screaming, and suddenly someone knocks on the door and the whole tone in the house changes. And everybody's on their best behavior. So I would literally, in very tough days, visualize whoever I visualize sitting on my couch. And I was thinking, you're supposed to visualize the Abish's listening, but your head's not there. Not that lofty, not when you're dealing with everybody coming home and it's hectic. But I would visualize someone sitting on my couch right in the room next door. And if I even started to raise my voice, I would lower it down and suddenly speak nicely, and lower the whole tone in the family. And that was something I really, really tried to work at.
Wow, that's beautiful. You also mentioned before about like different kids with different needs. Some may be leaders, some may be followers. Do you have any advice or insight, like how, as mothers, we can get to know our children better and their needs?
First of all, by studying your children. But surprisingly enough, some parents don't necessarily see their children. They see it through a certain vision of that they see their child in. So if you ask even the teacher, you don't have to like the teacher, but let's example, a third grade teacher. I've been teaching third grade for many years, so I do know what's within the range of norm for a third grade student. So if it's this, if it's that, is that kind of reading okay for a third grade level? Is that kind of processing something that'll resolve itself? So if you can't, so first of all, friends can sometimes see your children very clearly, and also parents. And if parents tune in and really look at the child the way the child is. Like one of my kids complimented me once and said, "Ma, you saw us as who we are. You never, like some people idealize their children and think they walk on water and they're such wonderful children. I saw my kids' milas. I saw they're not their milas. And I really tried to address whatever subtly I could. You're only there to help our children be the best so they could be. But I tried to the best of my abilities to try to tune into my children. All my children needed very different things. And I took a lesson from, I have a very good friend, Sara Blau, from the Twersky family, the Bubov dynasty. And they had rebbes. I mean, they raised children who are Pashut rebbes. I taught one of her sons, and she always mentions that on his report, I taught kindergarten, and his report card, I wrote, I will say that I taught Shirley Twersky one day. Now he's off based in Lakewood. He's very chashviyid, really Rebbe material. So a child like that, when you bring them into a regular classroom like we have, that's a very difficult child to entertain and keep them. So she said she learned that she has to teach her children horizontally and not vertically. In other words, don't teach them the next pasuk chumash. Don't teach them. She taught them mishlei. She taught them music. She taught them other things. So they should never be bored in class. So if you have a child who's exceptionally bright, exceptionally capable, broaden their horizon with different things, see what it is that they need, and try to, each child needs something else. And so if you don't know sometimes, like, let me tell you, one of my things very much, it was intentional chinuch. So there was, everything I did in my life was a decision for my children. So should they go ice skating, for example? Should my children see movies? Should my children go on overnights? Everything I actually spoke with a friend of mine who I admired how her children turned out, and I would discuss it, and I would see what is it that works for our family. But then there was things that not everything worked for every child across the board in my family, because I have different children with different needs. I had a child who's Kenai Nahara, whose brain is Kenai Nahara, ultra, 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 ultra bright, and nothing school could teach her can fill her brain. So I had to allow this particular child to do many, many different things that my other children weren't even interested. She asked me once, "Ma, I want to get to know all the arts in the world." And we happen to live in Pittsburgh that has beautiful, famous museums. I said, "Sure." So she went and she got herself educated on Monet. She took out books. She went to the museum. She studied the art forms. She's artistic. That was what that child needed. And I gave an okay. So not every shoe size is the same for every single child in the family. And children do understand sometimes when different children have different needs, that it's okay. Even in a classroom, they do tend to understand that some children need something that other children do not need. Another very, very, very important thing I really want to say, whatever kind of child you have, is a husband and wife should be on this, hopefully on the same page, because shalom bayis is the foundation of the children's well-being as much as possible. And I always say, there's always stages of marriage, but by the time your kids are teenagers, you pretty much should have your act together to a certain degree, at least in front of them. So one of the things I give my husband a lot of credit for, like I used to, my husband, the men are gvura and women are chesed, and the kid would want to do this, and I'd say, oh, let them. My husband would say no, and I would say, argue in front of the kids, why? And then my husband later on say to me, you never, ever, ever disagree in front of the children. And over the years, I learned how right he was. So the kid won't end up going to that party, or the kid will not remember the party and the details, but will remember that both parents were on the same page. To such a degree that my husband and I had, with one particular child, polar opposite approaches how this particular child should be raised. We just couldn't see eye to eye. So we went, both of us together, to a professional, and each of us presented our thing, and the professional guided us, and then immediately both of us were on the same page, same thing the child heard from both of us. Made no difference you're right and wrong. The point is to try to raise the best child that you could possibly have with things that work for them.
You mentioned before how today, Baruch Hashem, there's so many interventions and we're lucky. Do you, as someone who saw both, do you think that there's sometimes any downside to all the interventions that we have today, or anything to be aware of or careful of?
There is definitely, it's like a school is a shidduch is a shidduch, and a therapist is a shidduch. So one of the things is, I always say with therapy, it's like a short-term thing. Nobody's sitting in therapy, even if you're doing like a processing. You have to be able to see after a while that the kid is improving in math, the kid is improving in language skills. There has to be improvement. If improvement is not being seen and concrete change is not happening, then it's not the right fit. And it's hard because it's expensive. And I find many times interventions is short term. It's like, it's every other kid is what I found, and it doesn't last for years. It lasts for whatever months it lasts to get the kid over the hump, and then they move on. So it has to be something that a child is moving on from and is growing, and it has to be someone who has your hashkafa, which is very interesting. You do have to ask a Rav, because different Ravs will give you different answers about, where I live out of town, you do not have the luxury of from therapists now, even though now more and more. So you have to ask a Rav. Rav has asking some interesting things for me in the past, but they have to be someone who understands the concept of a large family, the value of a large family. For example, one of my children went to for something, and the therapist said, and it happened to be a frum therapist, and the frum therapist said to them, "Oh, you must have so much resentment. Your house was never your own. You had so many guests on Shabbos, and you had so many this, and you had so many that." And my daughter's, "What? We're Chabad. We love guests. It was the best things of our lives." And then we realized after a while, they couldn't relate to the lifestyle that we have. So it has to be someone who relates to it and respects that. That's very important. And there has to be a growth from it. And hopefully it should be short-term something.
Right. Yeah, that is important to keep in mind, that to evaluate, not just send for help, but is it making progress in any level? Like you said, processing, reading, learning, emotionally. I'm curious, you already did give us some examples, but I'm curious to hear if you have any more. Are there any more examples that you have of things that you learned from your parents that you brought into your chinuch in your home?
Well, my parents grew up at a very different time. They were time of survival. It was post-war. And they never actually, my mother once said to me when I started complaining about something, the way she raised us, and she said, I never saw parents raising a child. Her father was killed, like Kiddush Hashem, and she was 5.5 years old. She never had a home. So that generation was a generation of survivors and resilient survivors, which is another whole topic. And they raised a generation, like us. But theirs chinuch was a very much, I think, where they came from in their background, very much now that I have a daughter living in Russia. And so many things that I grew up with, she says, "Oh, Ma, this is really the Russian culture. It's cultural. It's not necessarily what we would think of as chinuch. It's just the way they raise their children there." But one of the things I learned from my parents very much is the bittul to the Rebbe. And the next thing that was really, really was very interesting to me, my parents are really opposites, total opposites. But they had such a respect for each other that our whole family grew up very, I'd like to say the word solid, just seeing the respect. They worked in different tracks, but they just respected each other's spaces, where they were, what they accomplished, and it was a beautiful thing to see. And I think we take what we grew up with, whatever chinuch we had. Even I have to say, the chinuch in schools now, I mean, people going to Beis Rivka are very, very, very lucky. The first time we opened the Tanya was when I was in seminary. We never even heard the word. We never heard of Tanya, Chassidus. We never learned that growing up. It wasn't even. So
It's
things have
unbelievable to
changed.
think about. You went to Beis Rivka and you didn't learn Tanya until seminary. Like
It's a very, the Beis Rivka you're seeing is not the Beis Rivka. It's the Beis Rivka that came out of the war and started being built. 50% of my class wasn't from. Beis Rivka was a very integrated school. So the from Lubavitch girls came there. From non-Chabad schools came there. And also children who weren't religious, but the parents wanted to have a Jewish background came there. So we grew up in a very, very integrated school. It doesn't look at all, and the chinuch doesn't resemble. It's become different as the generation has changed, the needs have changed. The chinuch is now amazing, and it starts younger and younger and younger. The chassidus and the inoculation of chassidus, it's a whole different world.
It was amazing then too. It just has advanced. It's like the whole world.
It's advanced, a different world. It's not even just advanced.
Wow.
It's not even the same picture. It's really not the same picture. But we also had the Rebbe, which was a very big thing. That having the Rebbe there was a very, But I think really the bottom line is that our children have to feel our acceptance and our love. And it's not always easy to love every child when they're going through difficult stages where they're being chutzpahdik and they're deliberately doing things they're not supposed right. And as a parent, you really have to work on that love and that acceptance. Because if we don't back our children, and if we're not there for them, who will be there for our child? One of the things that I really worked with my children was the macro vision. I tried to visualize what will they be in the future. I had kids who were very lively. There are some kids who teachers will not forget. I had a couple of those kids. Until today, I'll see a teacher from years ago and say, "Oh, yeah, your child. And I used to keep this macro vision that, so now they have kaichas, now they're chutzpahdik, now they're this, now they're that. But they're going to use those things to become leaders one day. They're going to use it for the good. And I try to if you're able to visualize the future of your child and not get stuck in the detail of where you are right now and accept them for who they will be eventually and who they will develop into and mature into, I found that also helped me a lot. If you want to say the word ignoring, my kids said, "Ma, there was a lot of ignoring when we were growing up as teens." And I said, absolutely there was. Any yelling and shouting and screaming at me and different things that happened. I just pretended I didn't hear. I pretended I didn't see. Not everything needed parental intervention. Part of my macro vision of seeing my kids, who they will be mature into, helped me stay calm, helped me stay controlled now in the situation. I tried not to get bogged down into the detail that's happening right now, into the negative that's happening right now. And I have to tell you, that wasn't always easy because I have, Baruch Hashem, teen after teen after teen after teen, and I had 3-4 teens at a time. And sometimes I really felt myself being stretched. And I really had to work on calming. And it was a very conscious decision of trying to stay calm so my house will have a certain level of, I want to say, peace in it. It wasn't a peaceful house. It was a lively house. But the yelling and screaming didn't come from me. It came from just the natural children being children.
Wow. So as this mother of a beautiful, large family, and everything that we've been discussing, if you had your ending takeaway for us mothers? What are some things you would tell us as a wrap up?
It may sound corny, and it is corny. This is actually what I did. When I was having a particularly hard time with my children, I would literally visualize that this child is a prince of Hashem. And if this child is a prince of Hashem, how do you treat that prince? You're not going to yell, you're not going to scream, you're not going to patch, because the king is going to account for it eventually. So I literally would, this is a prince of Hashem. No matter how they're acting, they are still the essence.
Prince or princess?
Or a princess, right, or a princess. And the next was the visualization of having someone sitting on my couch and listening in to what's going on in my home. And that literally forced me to speak sweetly and kindly, even though if I necessarily didn't feel that on the inside, but at least on the outside, it was a certain calmness.
Right. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that your Myra, your fear of heaven should be at least as much as your fear of people.
Yeah, my fear of people, I think, was a little bit more than my fear of heaven.
Right. Halavaya should be as much. Exactly. Is there anything you did specifically
I'd like
for your
to just
kids?
finish off. I was saying one of the things that many of us have all resentments about our childhood, how we grew up. There's this, that, and that, and that. I realized that maybe I'm wrong, but this is the bit I realized that I finally grew up is when I realized that my parents did the best that they could with the tools that they had at that time. And we're supposed to take these tools and do better with our children. And our children are doing better with their children. Because Baruch Hashem, we have in a time where there's so much education and there's so much learning and there's so much available that hasn't been available in the past. And the bottom line is, very, very important takeaway, is to say your sons or daughters kapitel and Tehillim. A busy mother or a father would not always have time to say all the kapitlach unless you're saved very super quick. My husband learned very quickly. We said all the Torah took super reading, but me it takes time. So he would say everybody's kapitlach every single day. And actually, my father-in-law would note. I just want to say that he said every child and grandchild's kapitel every single day of his life.
Wow.
So whatever the oldest grandchild was, I remember 49. He said from Aleph through Nun every single day. It's just this concept of someone saying the kapitel Tehillim. What I've learned is, though, because you're a busy person, you don't always have time, especially when you're a busy mom with so much going on in your life, is that the child that needs it the most, those are the kapitlach would be. So if you wanted 2 kapitlach, I would say, depending what it is, and say it as long as you need to say it. So the kapitel Tehillim is very important. And at the end of the day, it's all siyata d'shmai. It's truly up to Hashem. We have to daven to Hashem. We put in, if you want to say, pretty much similar ingredients into our children, but all our children come out very differently. And especially now in challenging times, parents are trying the best that they can, and children are taking paths that the parents didn't even visualize they would take it one day. But these are paths that the Eibusher had in mind for our children that we did not have in mind. So again, in those cases, it's double love and double acceptance and double saying of Tehillim. But it's also, I think it comes to a point where, I tell a lot of parents, you do the best that you could with the kelim that you have. And it comes to a point, you did the best that you could you've done better. You're getting smarter as you're getting older and you're learning more. That's true. Some parents, it means getting tighter with the younger kids. Some parents, it means letting go. But knowing that you did the best that you can, and the children are the prince and princess of Hashem, it's their journey. We're just there to guide them along the way. And as somebody said who has a child who's going through a very, very difficult journey now, they said, more than the child changing, we as parents have changed. So all this, the Eibusher gives us our children to change us, and we to have a little bit of schos to help them develop who the Eibusher wants them to be. And to be, the bottom line is, of course, we want them to be chassidish, we want them to be giving, we want them to be good, but you want them to be productive. You want to give them to give to the world, in whatever way they can, in whatever capacity you can, to be the best that they can. And you just have to thank the Eibusher for what you have and ask him for future guidance and constant tefillos that it should continue. And the Eibusher should give you the wisdom. Every single birthday, I have the same machlata for years and years and years, the same machlata. The Eibusher should give me the wisdom to know what my children need. And that's...
Wow. It's true. The Eibusher should give all of us the wisdom to know what our children need. Thank you so, so much, Mrs. Itkin, for your ideas, your inspiration, Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Share this podcast, share it with your friends. Thank you.